Today I'm speaking with Dustin Curlee. Dustin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
It's so great to meet you. And I've been on another podcast with you with Alan Bondar before in a live stream, so it's good to see you again. But as a quick bio here to get started, Dustin studied at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he and his wife Jennifer live in San Antonio, Texas. They have two boys. He's also the owner and CEO at a company called Transactions Made Easy, which is a real estate company. He also works again with Alan Bondar. There's a YouTube channel called Birds of a Feather. I'm going to put the link beneath this video. Please go like and subscribe. They discuss different deconstruction topics and some very interesting stuff that they've come across and been thinking through for years. So please do check that out. They're doing great work there. I appreciate your work on that. Before we get started with your story, could you just tell us more about yourself and some fun things, and then we'll get started?
Yeah, man. I have three rabbits, which I never thought I would have had. Got my first one named Vanilla because my at the time 8-year-old wanted a rabbit, and I thought it was the dumbest pet in the world, and ended up falling in love with it. And then we got Milo, which is Vanilla's buddy, and then we rescued one named Toasty, and Toasty's kind of my best buddy now. So I'm a rabbit wrangler.
Are they like regular size or the real big ones?
They're not the big ones. They're about 4 or 5 pounds.
Okay, gotcha. That's cool. Yeah. Very cool. I had a bunny or two when I was a kid, but I haven't had one in a while. But they're so adorable.
Yeah.
Well, we're so glad you're here. Again, thank you so much for all that you do for the community already. We love to hear people's stories. If you could take us back, how did you first get exposed to Christianity? And I'll jump in again with some questions.
So I was raised by my grandmother pretty much. And she was a Christian her entire life. So I was around it, but she never asked me to be a Christian or tried to proselytize me or anything like that. I was just around it pretty frequently, heard her talk about the Bible and Jesus and things like that. Much later on in life, when I was going through some pretty dark times, she invited me to a church here in San Antonio, a really well-known church with a very well-known dispensational pastor. And I had that salvation moment in 1995, where I walked down the aisle and gave my life to the Lord while they were singing "There's Room at the Cross," and it was very emotional and very, very powerful. And that is where I began my trek into Christianity.
At that point, were you going in because you were like afraid of hell, or because it just sounded like the truth, or pressure? Like, what do you think were the main motivations that got you to believe?
It was two things. It was the very first thing was hell, because of course the gospel message, ironically, that's what it is about mainly, is, you're a sinner and you need to be saved, otherwise you'll burn in hell. So that was a big part of the gospel message that I heard. But I'll be honest with you, at the same time, I felt a sense of belonging and community when I felt otherwise very isolated and alone. And so I thought that I was going to be accepted exactly as I was into that community. And that was very appealing to me. That was not the case, I found out afterwards, but that is what was very appealing.
In terms of like youth group or just church in general?
Well, I was 25 at the time, or 24, so it wasn't a youth group, but it was just a sense of people around me that said they loved me exactly as I was, because I was on drugs and I was very messed up, and so I felt very accepted, like I was at the time. And like I said, I felt really otherwise. I felt very, very isolated and alone, and pretty much a black sheep.
So up to that point, you had not really had a very clear gospel invitation given to you?
No.
Okay.
Nope.
Once you were saved, I know some people talk about the whole immediate transformation. You're born again and your life turns upside down. Was it like that with you in terms of the drug and the acceptance stuff you mentioned, and just your
internal peace?
Yeah, it
was, man. Yeah, it was. And I'll tell you why, because I latched onto the law. The law was very pragmatic. It was very black and white. And so I understood that kind of ascetic, rote behavior modification. And so I set out on a course to become very, very holy, and to produce good fruits, and to live a righteous life. That was very, very, very important to me because I wanted to honor this God that had saved me from these travails that I was living in that were so painful up to that time. I really wanted to honor and please that God that I had felt done that for me at that time. So yeah.
In terms of the church's acceptance of you, what was that like? You said it was not quite what you expected.
Yeah, no, man. You hear all about the come just as you are, and that's the message was actually the pastor was John Hagee, just so everybody knows. I mean, he's very famous.
Yep.
He does this thing where he snaps into his lapel mic, and I mean, it sounds like a firecracker going off, and I believe it is a method to snap people into that altar call. And so he was saying, come exactly as you are. The Lord loves you exactly as you are. Come down to the altar. And he would do that kind of a thing. And, I felt, wow, they will accept me just as I am right now, dressed like I am in this plush, affluent crowd that I'm in, and I smell and they love me just as I am. And they're never going to judge me. And I feel so accepted right now. Well, at the altar call, yeah. But then immediately after that, well, now look, here's what you need to start doing. You got to get plugged in, and here are some things that a real believer, that a true follower of Jesus Christ, these are things that begin to manifest themselves in the life of a believer. And so I quickly understood that that we accept you as you are was just for that one moment, just until you make that proclamation of faith, and then things change. Then we accept you up to a point, but you got to start making some changes. And if you don't, well, that tells us everything that we need to know. And so that was hard for me because I grew up in a very conditionally love-based home where if I did enough, then I was given love. And if I did not, that love was pulled away. And that is exactly how the church felt. After that moment, all of a sudden it was, well, we'll love you if you're doing these right things. But if you're not, there's this thing called church discipline, and there's this thing called restoring one to the faith. And there's these things in Hebrews that Hebrews talks about where we need to bring you back into the fold. I started learning all about that nomenclature, and all of those things begin to build. It was a lot of pressure to feel like I needed to manifest all of these things that I was being told a real believer would manifest.
When you look at that, especially with your background that you described from your childhood, was that inviting in the sense of, oh, okay, this is like the path to get things in order. If I jump through all the hoops, I'm acceptable, but I'm also kind of shining and radiant and polished and everybody is applauding? Or did that feel like that was intimidating and kind of scary?
It felt inauthentic is what it felt like. And I always knew that, but I did not want to risk losing that community and losing that feeling of being right with God. I didn't want to lose those things and suddenly go back to that life that I had come from and that feeling of loneliness and despair and hopelessness. I didn't want to go back to that. And so I just kept plugging along, which that also bled over into my study endeavors because, I began being told we have to rightly divide the word of truth, and a Berean studies to show himself approved. And I was like, oh crap. Well, I better start doing that too. And it just kind of kept piling up. The longer I was in it, it kept piling up. And throughout the tenure of my time as a Christian, which was almost 30 years, man, I went to a lot of people and told them about this feeling, and they would say, yeah, I know what you're talking about, but you just have to kind of let that go. And it was almost like they were putting it on a shelf and just ignoring it. And I couldn't do that. I couldn't just ignore that feeling. I didn't understand why I felt like that when this gospel message was presented to me in one way, but then the rug was pulled out after that. It just didn't make sense.
Yeah, I definitely can understand it. I think my experience was a little bit different in that being that I was sort of in it from the earliest days, it felt a little bit more natural. And I think when you get indoctrinated from a young age, you definitely have the sense that this is easy. He says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And you do get the sense of like there was a normal Christian life. There's even a book I read, I think from Watchman Nee, The Normal Christian Life, something like that. But you get the sense that like if you just do it God's way, it'll be fine. But also if you choose to not do it God's way, that's your choice. But it will fall apart. So it's like if it ever does feel like it's not quite working right, it's always your fault. Like
It's
you're the
your
one
fault.
that's you
A
didn't
lack of faith or a lack of discipline.
Yeah, and like the prodigal son story, like he's waiting there. If you want to go spoil your life and waste your life and your resources, go for it. But the minute you turn around, he's not going to feel a million miles away. He's going to feel like he's been right there all along. But you do have to turn away from your sin to do it. And once you convince someone that repentance is basically the crux of the issue, you just feel like if I'm not feeling it to enjoy the Lord or whatever, if I don't feel that intimacy and closeness, there's something I need to repent of. But did you, apart from the church thing, did you feel like just your quiet time with the Lord was developing over those years? Like, what was it like apart from the whole church culture, just you and God and the gospel?
Yeah, I mean, I really did. I felt I had a very personal relationship with God. I began to study fervently, man. I mean, all of my spare time was devoted to reading the Bible, trying to understand the character of God, talking with God constantly. I mean, I was constantly talking with God, praying and asking for guidance, asking for direction, asking for what my purpose was within the Christian culture and the world at large. And I mean, it was very personal. It was very deep, very ongoing. I was constantly trying to enlarge it.
When you look at your church, the theology there is pretty intense. How long were you again at John Hagee's church?
I was only there for about 6 months before I went to another non-denominational church. It was a real big one. And it was about 2 miles away. It was a non-denominational church. It was very loosely Baptist affiliated, but more just kind of a Christian denomination. Seeker sensitive, it would have been called a seeker sensitive church, They followed the typical creeds, but they had no stance on eschatology, and things like that. So it was, just kind of a non-denominational, but still very, very, very much focused on righteousness and progressive sanctification and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. With just go back to John Hagee for 1 second. Did you get caught up at all in the eschatology and remember like the books on blood moons and stuff like that?
Yeah, man. I immediately became engulfed in that stuff, and I that was my very first position on eschatology was a staunch dispensationalism too. And he would have these, they had to have been 50 yards long on the stage, these massive things, diagrams up with these monsters and four-headed beast and and he would explain all of it. And I would write it all down, and I just drank all that stuff up and learned how the 430 years of Daniel was on a pause. It was on a pause right now until this was going to happen. And then there were going to be these extra years that fulfilled that gap and all. I was into all that stuff back then. And I think most Christians, quite honestly, what I call antiquated Christians, which we can get into if you want later, and these new hybrid Christians, I think everybody is a kind of a futurist by osmosis when they're in the church.
Yeah. One thing that often goes along with that is the idea of spiritual warfare, like that there's things going on.
We wrestle not against flesh and blood.
Right. But did you feel like some of your struggles or your lack of feeling as close to God as you maybe wanted to at times was just more of a spiritual battle, and that, it was Satan.
Yeah, it was Satan. Yeah, there was lots of temptations from Satan and demons were battling for my soul, and there were angels simultaneously warring those demons, and God gave everybody a set of angels to battle those things. And man, and Tim, I laid awake at night and just tried to ponder all of that stuff and how that worked and what it was like. And it was, to be honest with you, it was petrifying at times, because I was like, good God. So there's demons right now warring for my soul. And that's why I feel tempted. And that's why, which put the culpability on something else other than me. but then, there's also these angels who are battling these demons at the same time. And it's in this spiritual realm that I can't see. And all I can do is just pray and pray that God would show me favor and win this war. I mean, oh my gosh, man.
Is that fervor to understand and to dig deeper? Was that what prompted you to go to seminary, or what was the journey like to get you there?
I realized that I was not going to learn enough just talking with people. Well, let me clarify that. I was not going to learn enough to be considered for a position in the church, most likely, by just talking to people. I needed to be involved in some sort of a formal education in order to really understand what those guys understood, these pastors and teachers. I needed to be in a seminary in order to understand that. That was the impetus for seminary.
What was your experience there like?
Terrible. Man,
Really?
It was, all I wanted to do was understand the Bible. I mean, that is the source document for all theology and doctrine, theoretically, allegedly. And so I wanted to understand that book. I mean, I really, really wanted to know what the Bible said, how it was put together, how to interpret it, what are the approaches, all of these things. And I got into seminary and very quickly realized that's not what seminary was about. At least not. I know that there are some that are more focused on that. Southwestern was not. It was, Christ against culture, homiletics, worship in the modern church. It was all those kinds of things. And the only class I did like was there was a history class by this female professor who, that woman was incredible. And you could tell she was very genuine and very passionate. And her account of history, Christian history, was very objective. And that is where some of the first kind of, oh crap moments began to plant themselves in me, because I realized that there were some issues with Christian history.
Yeah, for sure.
But so my tenure at seminary got cut short because I was in an Old Testament class, and this professor came in and he leaned over the podium, and I mean, he had his arm on it and he's rocking back and forth like he was preaching a sermon, and he was doing, and he was pontificating. And I mean, it was like a show. And we were going through Habakkuk, however you want to pronounce it. And I remember reading it thinking, this is not the context of this book. I mean, this is not at all what this is about. And I was super confused, but I literally felt like a nobody even back then. And so I didn't dare raise my hand and say anything, but this guy in front of me raised up his hand and he said, "Hey, professor, this has nothing to do with this prophet." I mean, and he began to give the context of Israel and all these, and that professor got so angry and, said, "Why don't you mind your business? And how about you let me teach this class, or unless you want to come up here and teach this class." And there were about 8 of us that literally got up at that moment. We walked out of that class, and
Wow.
we dropped that class. And I left seminary shortly after that, because I realized why people called it cemetery going in. Is just, man, it was not what it was cracked up to be.
It's amazing that you all had the bravery to get out like that. That's awesome. I had some situations like that in Bible college a little bit. We were all younger, and I think we all felt like we just need to sit down and shut up and kind of learn from the masters.
Yep.
But I remember one guy was talking about dispensationalism. It wasn't a fully dispensationalist Bible college, but it had a lot of leanings that way. And this one, he was just like, anybody that disagreed, and I'll tell you what the locusts are in Revelation, and they're exactly this, and this is exactly what Gog and Magog is. And I mean, if you disagree with him, he just kind of he wouldn't get upset. He just kind of laugh at you like, just keep digging, you'll get there. Yep. You'll see someday.
Yep.
And everyone else is kind of like lesser than him. But it's fascinating too when you do see up close. I'm sure I've seen it at some point, but just that experience of seeing the arrogance in Christians, and the idea that they know that they're right and they can't be questioned. And I've said this before, so I won't prolong this too much, but I think it's amazing to me how Christians are often ignorant of the way that they move deconstruction and people along, because often deconstruction is not about Christians' attitudes. I'm sure it is sometimes, but it isn't about, well, you seem like a jerk, or you seem like you're really rude. It just is like, I have a question about this text, but then they act like that professor. It's like, oh, okay, so we actually have two tracks here. One of them is just pure information. The other one is that the Christians seem willing to put their head in the sand or ignore the issues or actually aggressively try to shut you down for just asking honest questions. And those two questions, tracks, I'm sure there's some more, but at least those two tracks, they just like snowball. And Christians, like once you really get that snowball moving a little bit, I don't think Christians realize like how bad it gets at that point. Like you can't pull that curtain back. You can't hide the wizard anymore. Like we've seen too much. And they just act like, well, we've got the authority. And if it's almost like a church discipline thing, like I'm going to kind of hand you over to Satan. But if you're really a child of God, God will bring you back. It's like, no, when we're talking about intellectual pursuits and information, if we keep on digging, we're going to find some stuff. And there's no way to just come back once you find certain information. With your journey into seminary, was there any sense of you becoming a pastor or missionary or full-time Bible teacher?
I was a youth pastor at the time of a large church, and I had grown that youth group from 10 people to about 130 youths. And so it was big, and I needed to feel qualified to my peers and the parents in order to be able to be in that position. And that was why I went in, because I wanted to be able to feel qualified to teach the Bible to these kids and to be able to dialogue with my peers about these things regarding theology and doctrine.
When you started doing that ministry, did it feel like some of your questions got answered? I mean, sometimes it feels like our heads get big when we get in ministry. We get the authority and the power, the keys to the church, but did it feel like some of the questions got answered by you just being in leadership?
Man, I'll be honest with you. Some of the questions felt like they had answers, but every single answer always kind of made me literally, I would just kind of scratch my head and go, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but, and there just always seemed to be this unanswered thing that everyone just got, well, that's one of those things. We'll talk about that another time, or that's just a mystery, or God is bigger than us, or God's ways are not our ways. There was always these really ambiguous, esoteric, sweeping under the rug things. And the more answers I thought I got, the more questions came. And that is what happened to me. Was I call it the upside down funnel. I didn't answer questions down into a nice package. Every time I thought I had a question answered, it gave me more questions, and this funnel just began to increase.
I'm curious. It sounds like a lot of your questions were more theological. Were there any questions that were more practical, such as why did that 3-year-old die of cancer?
Not at first. No. Man, not at first. I was very, very, I'm telling you, man, because of where I came from a horrific, horrific past. Jail, prison, homelessness. I mean, it was bad. And so being a part of that church community and that structure and that having a purpose as a youth pastor in this, that meant everything to me. And so having a formulaic, systematic theology was, I loved systematic theology because that had the answers. Here is exactly how it works. This is exactly what you do. And it's A through Z. And so that's what mattered to me at first, Tim, was systematic theology and being able to answer those questions and feeling like no matter what was posed, I could take a few moments to go through this matrix and come up with some sort of a postulation that would make sense. That's what mattered at first.
And am I remembering correctly? Did you get into preterism at a certain point?
So that is when it moved from systematic thinking to being more human-minded, because I feel like theology and doctrine cultivates sociopaths. And I don't mean that as a pejorative. I really don't, man. I'm being sincere. I really feel like, especially in academics and studies, theology, I mean, in seminaries and so forth, in academics, and that it begins to breed sociopaths, man, where you're not so much concerned about the human beings you're talking about or you know, considering things. It becomes more about the formulas and the boxes and the ideas and the constructs and the philosophies, and that's what you defend at all costs. And I had gone over the course of years from a very free will dispensational kind of thinker to an reformed community 5 point Calvinist amillennial type person. And at that point, I was the associate pastor of a reformed church, home church, where everybody homeschooled, and it was a family worship, family integrated worship, and very Doug Wilson. I knew Doug Wilson, and we were in that community. And I there was this missionary who came from Nigeria, and they practiced polygamy. And I mean, I didn't know what to do with that. Talking with this guy, I was like, and I wanted to say that's wrong. The Bible teaches one man, one woman, and that's God's institution for marriage. But this guy left, and I remember talking to my pastor about it, and my pastor began to ask questions. Well, how do you go to a different culture like that where it is legal and everyone does it, and you tell that man that he's wrong? Because he's providing for his wives. And then he began to tell me things like, well, what about David, who had innumerable wives and concubines, and all of the kings of Israel and these prophets, they all had multiple wives and concubines, and it's never condemned in the Bible. So what do you do with that? And he wasn't telling me it was right. He was just posing rational questions. And man, my brain started to short circuit, because I realized what I had done at that point, especially with Calvinism, was I had detached from the human race and become all theology minded, and not at all thinking about the human beings I was saying these things about. And I was a partial preterist at that point, who had just read Sproul's book. I can't remember what it's called now.
Can you put a pin in that and just define preterism for anyone that doesn't understand it?
Yeah. So preterism just means things of the past, or fulfilled in the past, is the very loose definition of it. And there's all sorts of schisms within preterism, just like there are every faction of Christianity. There's partial preterist, and then there's full preterist, or what some people call as a pejorative, hyper preterist. Then even within full preterism, there's covenant eschatology, covenant creationism, there's Israel only. I mean, there's all these different gamuts of preterism, but I was a partial preterist, which means I believed that everything in the New Testament was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, except for the final return of the Lord, which was a future event at some point. And that was kind of a comma in all of those prophetic utterances in the New Testament, which that never made sense to me as a partial preterist either. But that's where I was at that point. And that is when I began to consider human beings, and I began to ask those questions that you mentioned, Tim. Why is it that these parents pray and their child is dying of leukemia, a torturous death, and that child ends up dying? Why are girls being sex trafficked and forcefully injected heroin to keep them as sex slaves, and eventually tossed aside in dumpsters as trash? And why does one person give glory to the Lord for getting a new Range Rover, and another person is serving the ministry tirelessly and they can barely make ends meet? All those questions, like a Pandora's box, began to open up.
It's amazing. When you got to that point that you're referring to, did you kind of feel afraid? Like, I wonder if I'm playing with fire here, literal fire of hell, or just playing with fire of my own pride and arrogance? Or did you feel like God was open to, like, hey, I'm being honest here, God, I just really want some answers?
I was very sincere. I wanted answers, and I was willing to go to any length to get those answers. I was deconstructing hell at that point. Preterism tends to do that, and I was almost at the point of completely abandoning the idea of hell completely. So I wasn't so
Hmm.
much concerned about that, although I do always think it's a lurking notion. Even when people abandon it, it's that fear. There's that indoctrination of an eternal conscious torment in, a disembodied soul torture chamber that's a scary proposition. Um, but really, man, I wanted to understand my God. That was the crux of the issue for me, was the character of this God. Because if God is all knowing and all powerful and all present and this all loving, this omnibenevolent being, which the tenets of historic Christianity teach, then I I couldn't understand anymore how this kind of stuff was happening. And I began to seek those answers out. And I was having some conversations with some pretty big names in the theological community, and I eventually got completely ostracized. I got blacklisted. I couldn't ask questions in their groups anymore. They wouldn't talk to me anymore. I was told I was skirting with heterodoxy, which I had to look up. I didn't even know what that word meant back then. And I thought, outside of the confines of orthodoxy, how is me asking questions a danger to orthodoxy? I mean, you should have answers to those questions. It shouldn't be dangerous to ask them. That seemed bass backwards to me, man. I was like, no. And
And
then when
the
they all
Bible even specifically says, like you said, the word Berean, like search out these things to see if they're so. You should be rightly approved, able to divide the word of truth. It says, you should always have a reason for the faith that's in you. Plus, the whole field of apologetics is exactly those hard questions. Like, what the hell? But yeah, there's still certain limits. It's
Yep.
amazing.
Oh, there are definitely limits. And even early on, I did countercult apologetics, man. I was very involved in debating Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and all these kinds of things. And even then I began to learn there were limits to the questions you could ask, which always kind of confused me, but never began to bother me until that moment when I was involved in partial preterism and almost made the jump to full preterism when I really began to be bothered by um the hypocrisy of Christianity in general as an institution, and specifically the people I was dealing with.
Yeah. Hmm. So at that point, it sounds like there was just sort of the idea in my mind, like juggling. You're juggling balls or trying to hold the spinning plates up. Did you ever get back to a point of feeling safe, or was that just like, is that the off ramp that just kept moving, or did you
Nope.
get back to a point of safety?
Nope. Once the doors open, man, it's once you once a person within that cult, because it is a cult, once that person begins to commit to asking those questions and finding the answers, it's over. I do not believe a person will remain in the cult if they pursue that. They will not do it, because what happens is you begin to see through all of the sophistry and the rhetoric. You begin to see through all of it, and you're no longer okay with being given those kinds of answers. I don't know how many people I talk to, and I would just look at them and go, okay, thanks, and then just move along and think, you're so full of it, and you know it, and I know it too. And I would just move along and try and find the next person and start digging in. And what was so crazy to me is the only people that I found that were really authentic were the people who were considered heretics. They were the ones who were honest about the text. Even people like Dominic Crossan and those guys, who they have some odd thinking, but even those guys were Bart Ehrman. Um, there's just a whole bunch of them that I began to read, because I would read a book, and Sproul did it. Sproul's the one who, The Last Days According to Jesus, that was the book. I read that, and he mentioned James Stewart Russell's The Parousia, and I got that book. Oh man, that I read through that book and was like, what the heck? And but then James Stewart Russell mentioned some authors, so I would go read those authors. And then those authors would, And eventually I went so far down the rabbit hole of what was considered orthodox writing that I was way off in what would be considered secular authorship at that point. But those people were so honest with the text. And they would say, I don't know the answer to this, but it sure is not this. And intuitively, I knew all along these last 20 years, that is what I have been thinking. This is not right. And I knew it. Intuitively, I knew it.
It's amazing. I saw even just the other day, one of those little meme things that the Christians put out of 66 books and no contradictions and 60,000 cross references of prophecies and all this. Just an amazing book, clearly divine. And it was funny it was someone that posted it, but it was in a public spot where other kinds of Christians could kind of see it and jump in. And they literally were immediately debating the number 66 as the book. So it's not 66, it's whatever. And they started, there's immediately, and the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, yeah, and the Roman Catholic Church, and all these people, and they're literally arguing over the number of which books. And I was like, you're proving our point. That's the point. You guys don't even know which book should be in. And when you dig deeper, it's not just the books as a whole, it's which versions of the books and which specific texts got added and changed and edited.
Bro.
And it's come on. And to me, that was where, when I was deconstructing, that was where I couldn't put the words to I'm deconstructing here. It's just, you just think something's wrong.
Yeah.
But it just felt more and more and more gross in the sense of my God, the God in my head, my God is perfect. He wouldn't put out such a shitty product. He wouldn't do this to us. He would be clear. Our God is not a God of confusion. And it's come on, something's wrong here. And,
and think about this. James 3:1, not everyone should desire to be teachers because teachers of the law are judged more harshly. That always stood out to me because John 14 says that the Holy Spirit is given to lead Christians into all truth. So Christians have God inside of them because the hypostatic union, which is a philosophical construct, but it's a part of historic Christianity, you have the Holy Spirit, which is God inside of you, which leads you into all truth. So 2 denominations would be one too many, but there are thousands of them, and none of them can agree on some of the most basic things. And then you get into some of the more complex issues like the character of God himself, hermeneutics, interpretation of passages that have really dire outcomes of things. And then I'll tell you, Tim, the other thing that really, really, really bothered me, and it was one of the questions I asked people from no-name churches all the way up to Sproul and John MacArthur and guys like that. I asked them this question. Have you ever grown in your understanding of theology? Well, of course I have. Paul says we go from milk to meat and blah, blah, blah. And I got the same answer every single time. Yes, I've grown. So when you were teaching what you now consider wrong, were you misleading or deceiving the people? Well, not intentionally. It doesn't matter if it was intentional or not. Were you misleading the people in the Word of God? You had the Holy Spirit. Were you teaching them error? And I never once would any person say, well, yeah, you're right. They would hem-haw around it and skirt around. And I thought, no, man. It's true. You were teaching people what you now consider wrong theology. You were teaching that as dogma.
That's such great points. And I think as a parallel too, the idea of, if this is God speaking, he's going to lead you into truth. But in a similar sense, if it's God that's in you, he is going to transform you. That was where my lordship salvation is coming into play here. I was there with John MacArthur for years as a teenager. But it's not just that he's going to lead you into truth. He's going to lead you into holiness, into fervor, into zeal for the gospel, for the Bible, and for himself. And I would see people around me left and right that were you guys are cantankerous. You're boring. You're
slanderers, gossips,
and you don't really care about anything. And it was if God is in you and you listen to Christian radio all the time, and they did, It's like clearly he would have the power. I mean, I'm hearing this sermon. This is dunamis power, dynamite power. I'm like,
Yeah.
it seems like it's not really dynamite. It's like dynamite that's been soaked in water for 100 years. If it does pop, it's a very small pop and it's done. Like that's it. And I'm just like, this doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. Like, where is God in all this? And it was weird because for me, it was real. For some people, it is real. You're like, to you, it's like, this isn't a game.
Yep.
I'm not doing this for people to clap.
It
I'm
was
doing this for
everything
God.
to me.
Yeah. When you get though to that point where you did ask all those questions that were so intense, like what was it like when you finally got to a point where you realized, like, holy shit, I'm not asking myself which theology is correct. I'm asking if my entire worldview is correct, if maybe this whole thing is wrong. What was that like?
Yeah, it almost killed me, man. Literally, physically, it almost killed me because I I felt like all those existential questions had been answered. And I felt like I knew this God and his love for me and my place in the world. And even if I was rejected by this institution called the church, which is super corrupt now, God still loves me. But then when even those things began to unravel, it undid me, man. I began to realize that all the questions I thought I had answered were not answered. And so I resorted back to addiction. I started drinking again, and
Oh, wow.
and I drank until it almost killed me, and um, I mean I almost lost everything because I just couldn't understand why if God was God and loved me and loved my kids who he seems like he would take care of their dad and make their dad this and that and all this web of if God was this God, then why and out of everyone I knew, I was chasing after him with the heart of David. I mean, it was so genuine. I didn't care anything about glitz and glam and positions and power and paychecks, and I didn't care anything about that. All I cared about was my direct connection, and I knew something was not right. And it short circuited me, and I spiraled until I just about ended up dead.
So where was your wife in all this story? Was she tracking with you as a Christian or?
She was making her own, drawing her own conclusions based on her own studies and observations. Um, Also, my spiral did a lot to convince her of the vacuous nature of this God because she was praying like a madwoman, like Mary and Martha. She was at the feet of Jesus like Martha, just God, please, 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 please. And yet I was I mean, I would disappear for 3 days and she would know where I was. And I was spending $3,000 a month on alcohol. And I mean, I was dying because I just I couldn't make sense of it all.
Yeah. It's amazing when you really do believe it and it's your world and then it crumbles. It really can send you into a tailspin. My journey was a little different than that, but I get it. I really get it. What was it like the day you finally said the word in your head, atheist?
So, I had left the church and I had already declared to people I'm not a Christian anymore. So I felt comfortable with that, but I would not use the word atheist. I wouldn't even use the word agnostic at that point. I was spiritual. That's what I would say. But I had abandoned all things. I knew the Bible was a complete mess. I knew the stories of Jesus were fabrications. I knew all of that, but I was still clinging to some kind of, you know, nondescript idea of something until I finally, and I had gotten sober at that point, which that helped me. I mean, I'll be honest with you, the program of Alcoholics Anonymous helped me because when I got into step 2 and 3 of step 2 says came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, I had to come to terms with that. What was that power going to be? Because my life depended on it as an addict. I had to come to terms with that. And I did not believe in a being God. And so I had to come to terms with what that was, and I did. And that was when I began to go, okay, I am an atheist. I do not believe in the idea of the Bible God or any being God. There is no evidence for it. If there were, people could present it, and the case would be closed. So I am an atheist, a non-theist. I do not believe that. I am agnostic when it comes to what might be out there. There is definitely oddities that I can't explain, but I think they have more to do with matter and energy and a collective consciousness, and all of that energy and matter tied together than anything else. Not a non-personal being out there. But I
Right.
came to terms with that, Tim, and I was the very first time I used it was with Alan. He was like, "So are you an atheist?" And I was like, "I am." I am. I am an atheist. I do not believe in the Bible God. Certainly that one. That one's a pernicious, sick being. Nor do I believe in any, vague being out there. I don't believe in any of that at all. And it
Yeah.
felt, I will tell you, it felt like this. It was just this sigh of relief.
Hmm. When you told your wife that you're an atheist, was she okay with that?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yep. She was at that point. She was all, and she is a hyper rational thinker, very very logic based, almost in a savant kind of way. So she began putting two and two together, and she was like, "This is all of this whole train. I don't know how I even got on this train." So she may have been off of it before me, and then I will tell you what did it for her was these, because we've always homeschooled our boys, and so the majority of homeschoolers are Christian moms, which are some of the most vitriolic, hateful people in the world. And that is what sent her over, was the stuff she was seeing from these Christian homeschool moms. She was like, "This, if this God were real, none of this would be happening."
Yeah.
So
I agree. It's very sick, some of the stuff in those scripts, and they're very, very controlling. I was just curious, as a quick aside here, and I'll get right back to your story. As she saw that and you all talked about that kind of dynamic, in light of what's been happening in our society in the last 10 years, do you feel like, based on your background, you've got some insights for the Christian nationalism that is arising in terms of like why it's happening and how bad this could get?
it could get pretty bad. And I'm not pro Trump or anti Trump or pro Biden, but especially with Trump in office, because of his power trip. The dude likes power. It could definitely get worse. And I think Christian nationalism is a byproduct of this new hybrid Christianity that's happening. It's the old antiquated Christianity that you and I came from, where doctrine and theology is super important and systematic theology matters. Man, that is quickly becoming a thing of the past. It is, and I bet you within the next 10 or 15 years, it's almost gone. But this new weird hybrid Christianity where Jesus is just kind of a figure in love, but there's this overarching umbrella of Christian nationalism that is very important to all of them.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to see it, because you really, like, you reflect on a lot of this stuff. You go back to it over and like, what was I in and what was happening? But as you see this stuff like in real time happening in front of you in the news, it makes you realize that this really was much more cultural than we ever acknowledged. And in many ways, this really was probably, for a lot of people, even if they would have never said this, and I don't think it was true of me, but I think a lot of people around me, if they were really able to be honest with themselves, just flat out, like, you like, don't worry about what anybody says. If you could take a pill and just be completely honest, sort of like the was it Liar Liar movie, whatever.
Yeah.
You're completely honest. You can't hide your thoughts. They would say this is about white supremacy and male control. That's what this has always been about. It's never been about anything else. This is just a whole big system, but boil it down, and that's what it's about.
Well, and so it's interesting you say that, and I know you don't want to rabbit trail into this, but what's funny is you are seeing an upsurge of patriarchy right now, because that is a part of this movement, and it is a very seemingly loving model for the marriage institution, but it's not. But patriarchy is making a comeback right now because of that mess.
Yeah, the whole Theobros stuff.
Yep.
When you look at your journey, one of the biggest things that happens for so many of us is you do postmortems. You're looking back and you're saying, wow, like this thing really stole some time, stole a lot of my energy, my mental energy, my passion, stole my money, arguably my tithes and offerings. But it stole me. And you were, before you even got into church, were already in that spot where you were looking to get a platform on which to build your life solidly. Mm-hmm. And it's like they really took you at your most vulnerable and preyed upon you, PRUI, preyed upon you. You were desperate. You were like a guy in a desert, needing that canteen of water so bad. And they had it at the low cost of your entire life. And when we do these postmortems where we say, why did I get suckered in? Why didn't I see the red flags? Some of them harder to see, but some of them really easy, like a God who does circumcision. Like, what? This makes sense. The idea of the mythology, not realizing so clearly, like this is clearly coming from a mythology-based culture, and they're copying motifs that are already in the air.
Big time.
We just don't see it. But then when you see it, you kind of get on yourself a bit, like I should have seen it. The red flags were there. But you step back and you kind of say, you know what? Even though I see it now, and I couldn't go back if I wanted to, it still hurts. Like there's like tentacles and roots that are in me, and things that make me think, I told myself for 30 years I was a worthless piece of shit. And then I said it's all mythology. But because I said you're a worthless piece of shit for 30 years, that's still in you. Or whatever it is, or even just like that fear of like you mentioned with hell. It's like they have these things that make you think twice about it. And even in a like funny sense, like just saying, thank God when you almost get hit by a car, but you don't, you swerve and you slice by each other, you're fine. You have that temptation. Thank God I'm okay. And like, what are some of the things that you've found that you've had to really dig deep into and say, I intellectually know I'm out, but psychologically I'm not fully out yet? How do you get to the real life that you were trying to get to when you deconverted?
Yeah. So basically you're describing coming out of a Stockholm syndrome, because that's what it is. I mean, your Christianity is the perfect corollary to the beaten spouse analogy. You're told you're vile, you're a sinner, you're separated from God. Even your most righteous deeds are minstrel rags, and you can't do anything apart from him. He's the vine, you're the branches. I mean, the entire construct is built upon telling you how pathetic and impotent you are. And the only way to be able to do anything good or right or to be a person is to be connected to this God. That connection is exhibited or proven or validated by these fruits that have no consistency, denomination to denomination. And you have to judge yourself based upon those fruits in this particular kind of thinking. And it is just a roller coaster while you're in that movement. It really is. Coming out of it, I think every person coming out of it goes through a massive grieving process. And a lot of people stay in the anger phase because you go through a very angry phase, a deep embitterment towards that entire institution and anybody who represents it. And a lot of people stay in that and they write stuff against those people, and they talk about them and us and they speak about them very negatively and everything's bad and blah, blah. You have to move past that. You have to go through all of the phases of the grieving process until you come out on the other side and realize those people are no different than you, and they're stuck and they need help. And so hate is not going to do them any good. I need to be able to have conversations with them. For me, I had to get therapy when I first came out. I had to do a year and a half of therapy every single week to undo that sense of absolute worthlessness, which I already had going into it, and they just crystallized it and built upon it. I also began to read, with just the same fervor that I studied doctrine and theology. I had to begin to read things that built me up, things about the mind, things about inherent worth, And so I've been reading a ton of that stuff ever since I left Christianity, because now I'm free to read that stuff too. Um, and and really, man, there's just a day-to-day battle of undoing, rebuilding, and instilling ideas within yourself of who and what you are without this fairy tale thing.
Hmm. It's amazing. I love how when you go through that process, you really do learn, like you're saying, to love yourself, to just learn who you are. And it's hard though for me, where when I get to that point and I look at the people that you're talking about that are still stuck in it, I find myself at times wanting to talk to them, wanting to share some insights, but also knowing that until they're ready to really face the truth,
Yep.
that it's just too much. Like even the other day, somebody was asking me, lady was asking me, are you a Christian? And I said no, and we didn't get into it deep. It wasn't like an argument or anything. We're just chatting, real friendly. But she asked me, why don't you? And I said, well, I used to believe. And then I told her my history real briefly. And then I said, I really studied in depth the mythology behind it all. And she was like, what do you mean? And I gave her some examples of Dionysius and so forth. And she said, well, you know what? I know. You can believe what you want. It's like, I don't believe that stuff.
But I know.
Yeah. She's like, I don't believe that. I'm like, you don't believe Dionysius, or that he was a real mythological being that they used to worship? It's like, I just don't believe any of it. But I know that Jesus is real. He transforms my life every day. And it was just, a thousandth time that I've seen this evidence of like, this person isn't ready for the conversation. And it's literally a waste of my time.
Yeah.
How do you deal with the people that you love to give them some bit of information, but it's like, I mean, do you get into arguments with apologists, or do you feel like they're not worth their time?
I did about my first year or two coming out. Man, it was my mission to make them look and feel stupid, because I was angry. I was very angry, and I did. I mean, I cornered them, and I made them admit they didn't know, and that it was mystery. And I would say, well, a mystery by its very definition can't be explained. So you just made yourself look stupid. I mean, I did all of that. And I began to realize how petty I looked. And I began to realize that I was being the same kind of person that I did not want to be, that used to do that to me. They used to do that same thing to me. And I did not want to be like that. I also volunteered at a big organization that helps people recover from religious trauma. And man, the stories I heard volunteering, Tim, broke my freaking heart. 85% of those calls are from Protestants. 85%. 10% are Catholics, which is still considered Christian. And then like 4% are Islamist. And then there's, scattered few other than that. And nearly every single time, these people, their main concern was hell. And the other thing that I heard was their family and their friends were completely dejecting and ostracizing them and ignoring them and withdrawing from them just because they had questions. They were asking questions and being cast aside like disease. And it got so bad I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't volunteer anymore. It was just breaking my heart, because you begin to realize what's under the glossy film of what people present. It's a sick cult, man. And I still have a lot of every week I have conversations with Christians every single week. They either message me about my book, or they'll see something I post, because I don't post anything anti-Christian anymore. I just post things that I'm reading or studying or thoughts I'm having, and they'll say, so are you a Christian? Oh, no, I studied myself right out of that. That's what I always say. I studied myself right out of that. And then we begin to have conversations. So what I don't do anymore is I don't pigeonhole people. I just ask questions. Well, why do you believe that? And it always comes down to two things: experience and the Bible. Well, I experienced Jesus and he transformed my life. And I know that I know that I know. And I'll say, well, but doesn't a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hinduist, they say that exact same thing? They had an encounter with their deity and it changed their life. Well, yeah, but the Bible, and then they go to the Bible. And that's when I say, well, can you tell me about the Bible? And it all begins to unravel at that point. And within 5 or 10 minutes, they don't want to have conversations anymore. And I'll just tell them, hey, look, I completely understand. I really do. I was where you are at one point. If you ever want to talk, please let me know. Because I know where you're at and what it's like to come out from under all of that. And they'll say stuff like, I'm praying for you. And I'll say, well, thanks. I appreciate that. It used to offend me. It doesn't anymore. It's just their way of feeling okay about the. So I have really tried to enlarge my empathy for people who are within the movement. And because I have to remember that those people aren't stuck in the kind of Christianity you and I were stuck in, which has very clear lines in the sand. They're in a very seemingly innocuous gray hybrid Christianity, which isn't the same. And so I have to remember that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting too that I'm kind of glad that I'm not a Christian having to deal with the Christian nationalism stuff, because it was so different for me. There was no sense in my time that I remember, no sense that anyone ever gave me of we need to take over the world for Christ. It was simply we need to be willing to lay down our lives for the sake of the gospel.
Right.
And that, there will be a day when every knee bows, but it's not because we took over the government. And it's very different now. And I'm kind of glad that, because I think if I had been a Christian still, I would have had to have, I think, been compelled to walk those lines of like, how do you deal with the homosexuality issue, and how do you deal with Trump now? And I'm just like, it's just so different. It's a lot easier because it's a lot more obvious now that none of that stuff is relevant.
Yep.
But yeah, people are in bad spots. I mean, they're in real bad spots, especially where they're like seeing the red flags, but also seeing the hate that's going to come from Christians if they leave. When you look at this, it has a lot of implications for all the stuff we've touched on, but also for raising children. With your two boys that are like they're preteen, right? What is it like going through a deconversion process, having small children, but then also how does that change the way you see them and the way you parent them and talk to them? Because it's obviously it's a whole new world when you're not raising them to be little soldiers for Jesus.
Yeah, the very first thing that happened to me was I was so unbelievably grateful that I got them out of the church at such an early age. Because Jameson, my oldest, kind of remembers, but he just remembers his buddies and playing cars and stuff. That's all he remembers. Because he was about 4, so he barely even remembers. My 10-year-old doesn't remember it at all. The first thing that happened was I was super grateful that they were not subjected to that, because I believe that putting your kids in Sunday school and those things is a form of child abuse. I do. I don't think the parents are malicious. I don't think they're purposefully doing it, but it is child abuse. I mean, you're teaching children that they have no worth in and of themselves. You're teaching children that they're incapable. You're teaching children that they don't know God intuitively. You're teaching children that they can't do this and don't know that. And the only way they can do that is to be covered in blood from a man that this loving God murdered for them. I mean, it is so effed up, dude. And try as they might to make it look pretty with super cool songs, God told Noah to build him and Arky and all that kind of stuff. Underneath it, there is a real sense of sickness that I think kids see through. But you just indoctrinate them long enough and they just become automatons of that belief system. So I'm very glad I got them out of it. What I did begin to struggle with was, what do I teach them? How do I guide them in day-to-day life? And man, I'll be honest with you, I began to realize I didn't need to teach them. I needed to learn from them. Kids, you don't need to teach kids how to love every single person unconditionally. They just do it. You don't need to teach kids how to not be racist because they're not racist. You don't need to teach kids how to do the right thing because most times they just do the right thing. And when they don't do the wrong thing, it's not driven by some construct. It's just driven by a stupid selfishness or something of that nature. You don't have to teach kids to show affection. They just do it. And so I began to realize I don't actually need to teach them anything. I just need to encourage them to be like that as long as they can, which meant protecting them from some things, having conversations about other things, guiding them in the direction of some things and away from other things, but never, ever, ever telling them what they have to think, ever.
I love it. I can definitely relate to a lot of that because I had some similar emotions and experiences and transitions with my kids. It was a little bit different because there's, one parent that's, myself, an atheist, another parent that's still very fundamentalist Christian. But, I was young enough to be able to undo a lot of the damage and expose a lot of the mythology, which is, to me, makes a world of difference because their goal is to get them while they're young, while they're super impressionable. But it's also been so amazing to me to see the journey and just to see the beauty, because you would think as a Christian, like if you leave Christianity, there's nothing but darkness out there, and especially raising kids. And the beauty comes through. The beauty comes through the simplicity of it all, the loveliness of it all. And they're, like you said, they're good kids. They're not little sinners. They sometimes make foolish decisions, but sin isn't part of the equation. And I think too, one of the cool parts of it is when you are a Christian, at least in our culture, you're very frequently also spanking. And when you give kids the message, the clear message that says, not only are you free to think for yourself, but also your body is not going to ever be a threat. You're threatened. I'm never going to physically assault you. You put those and a few other, loving messages in there. And it's just like, if I can use the part of the phrase, oh my God, like this is amazing. These kids are superstars. They're rock stars. They're beautiful and they're growing, and they did not need all these constructs of all these verses. And when you realize too, the idea of the autonomy and the power that was taken from you, at least for me as a kid, was taken from you as a young adult. Like when you give that back to kids and say, you don't have to believe what anybody else believes. You can make up your own mind. And for them to feel that and really talk through it. Like I love what I do with my kids is I'll actually do this thing where I'll say, I want you to pretend there's like a glass bubble around your head, like an astronaut, But that glass bubble is, it's like a bubble you could pop or push around. And I say, I want you to imagine that that's your worldview. That's what you believe about the world and yourself. And I say, I want you to do this. And I would do this with the kids a lot when they were younger. I would say, I'm going to put my hand up and I'm going to put it towards your invisible space bubble around your head. And I'm going to say the words, I want to change your worldview. And we went through the word. I know worldview is a big word, but we went through it enough. They knew what I was talking about. But I said, I'm going to change your worldview. You have to believe like me. And I said, feel free to push my hand away. And of course they loved, like, I do not have to believe like you. And no, I don't. I say, oh, yes, you do. No, I don't. And when you're going out in the car or something, going to the park, I would be like, who has the power over what you believe? And they would be glad to yell it out. As, little kids love screaming and yelling. They would say, I do. I have the power. But you get that in them from the earliest days, not that you're sinners who have to bow the knee, but you can believe what you want and that you have the power, and you can also reject bad ideas. And I would even include myself, and I would say, do you need to think like daddy? No, I don't have to think like daddy. And that's important. They don't have to grow up to be atheists. That's not the end goal. That's not the prize is, I've got a family of atheists. The goal is I've got a family of free thinkers who are making their own decisions without fear of threats and so forth. But it's just a beautiful journey. And then when you think too, when you do go through that and you give that gift to your kids, you think, what would my life have been like if I had never been under this horrible belief system? And you almost kind of reparent yourself. It's, you can't go back and redeem the time, but you almost kind of imagine or pretend you can go back, or pretend you could have a time machine and go back and have a cup of coffee with your 18-year-old self and with your 10-year-old self and your 6-year-old self. Talk to that younger version and try to undo the damage. And it obviously it's not real. You're not actually changing your past, but it helps. It helps to kind of have those imaginary conversations. Does that make sense at all?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, I don't want my kids to be, well, back in the day, I used to call, even when I was still a Christian, I called this thing, there was regurgitated theology. And that's what nearly even the pastors behind the pulpits today, even them, even the the Rick Warrens and those guys, they all, I mean, like, look at Rick Warren's toolbox, and people can buy sermons in this Rick Warren toolbox, and they have prepared sermons, and they can just sprinkle in a little bit of personal stories and 7 steps to financial freedom as a Christian, 7 steps to a happy marriage within the Christian. I mean, everything is just regurgitated theology. Well, I read this commentary, and here's what this commentary says about this verse. Well, what do you think about that verse? Well, Spurgeon says that, and then Douglas Moo said that, but what do you think of? I mean, everything is just regurgitated theology, and I don't want parrots. I don't want kids who just say, well, my dad thinks. It doesn't matter what I think, you know? So I love that. I love what you're doing, and that's exactly what I do. I want them to be critically thinking, free thinking human beings.
Good stuff. Well, could I ask maybe a wrap up? The Birds of a Feather channel that you do with Alan Bondar. Again, all kudos to Alan too. He's doing great work. He's also got his own channel separately. I'll have the links for all these channels. Please go like and subscribe to them all. His other channel is called The Unraveler. But what are you doing on the Birds of a Feather channel? And sort of what would you say in general is on your heart to do at this point, besides your regular, work separate from this, but like in terms of the deconverting community and the religious trauma healing community, like what do you feel is on your heart at this point to do that you can make the best impact?
That's easy to answer. So as far as me and Alan, I've known Alan for a long, long, long time. We ran in the theological circles together and were friends and kind of came out around the same time and didn't even know it. So our podcast is really, we just have conversations about thoughts or doctrines or theology or things we're seeing, or some people will send us letters and, try and save us, or they're very hateful. We talk about whatever. Then every once in a while we have what's called a flock, where we'll have people on, like when we had you on, we'll have people on and just have a kind of a roundtable discussion of something. So, man, it's really just to have conversations as friends and about whatever comes up. We never have an agenda. We just start talking. So whatever you see on that is literally off the cuff. In terms of what I feel I am called to do, which is a weird word, what my heart is telling me I need to do. I'm starting my second book right now. I've got it all laid out and I've begun writing it. I am going to uncover the seemingly innocent and virtuous nature of Christian stories. And I am going to talk a lot about this new hybrid Christianity and a lot about propositional theology, which you see on social media, which I think social media is a plague if people don't know how to see through it. But for example, people post a picture of them in front of their new car and them going like this, and it'll say, God is so good. I prayed and I doing this and I got a new car. And they don't understand that is a proposition. That is a theological proposition that has massive implications to everyone who sees it and read it and thinks about it. But we're such this dissociated social media culture now that no one thinks through that stuff. So, like, I'm going to retell the story of Noah's Ark in its entirety, Abraham and Isaac, Job, Jesus. I'm going to retell those stories with all the little details nobody talks about, and ask the questions that nobody wants to ask. And they're going to be seen for just how sick they really are. And the whole hopes of that book, first of all, writing is always just mainly therapeutic. It's just therapy to get that stuff out. Yes. So I don't have any grandiose notions that it's going to become a bestseller, nothing like that at all. Probably 5 people will read it. But hopefully those 5 people will come out of it on the other side and go, I need to think through this a little bit more. That's my only hope. So my whole goal now is to just help people think about what they're saying and believing. That's it.
What was the first book?
It's called God in the Box, My Journey of Undoctrination. And it's a very candid autobiography of my going into Christianity, being saved into John Hagee's church, and then kind of what happened when I came out of it. And it is very raw. Most people say they read it in one sitting because it reads like a fast-paced, gritty autobiography of a guy who just about died. So
that's awesome. Well, I don't think I realized that you had written that book, so I'm sorry I didn't bring that up in the bio, but I'll include the link for that if anybody wants to go check that out, the book you already wrote. So when you do get your second book written, let me know. We'll do a follow-up interview and kind of put all your books on blast at that point. That's really
awesome,
cool.
Man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know I've asked you a lot of questions. Did you have anything else that was on your heart today that I didn't ask you about that you want to add?
No, man, I appreciate the conversation. I was very impressed by your very genuine way about you when we had you on the podcast. Because again, I think most people get stuck in a us versus them combative kind of mentality, and you don't seem like that, and I am not like that. I love those people. I feel a pain for them because of what they're trapped in, because I know what it's like. Even if their life is going great, they don't understand what it's doing and how much better things can be on the other side of that cult thinking. And so I just appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and hopefully one person will hear this and think, I need to start asking some questions and search for those answers, and search for them objectively, not based on what somebody tells me I should be thinking, but really start to look through this. And I mean, they will, very much like you said, I mean, because what did it for me ultimately was the mythology. Dennis MacDonald's book, bro, that book, every person should have to read that book and have an answer for it if they're a Christian.
Yeah.
Because they won't. And just those little things become big things. And after a time, they become too many things. And you're forced to either become very intellectually dishonest with yourself, or you have to say, okay, let's go where this leads.
Yeah. And that's the crux of the matter is, do you really want an examined life, an examined faith, or do you just want your inherited culture and your societal
heritage
pressures?
Theology.
Yeah. Do you want your soft baby blanket to keep you comfortable, or do you want the truth? And for so many of us, that just really getting to answer that question in our hearts, like, I really want the truth more than what I believe currently, whether they're the same or not. They may be the same in the end. I may have become more firm in my belief, but either way, I'm willing to take the risk. And it's like, if you really believe that your God is that powerful and that brilliant and that smart and that amazing, then he shouldn't be afraid of the hard questions. But for so many Christians, it really comes down to that. And they do have to, sort of check their brains at the door. But it's a hard journey, but it's well worth it. And I should ask this, I ask this a lot, and I'll ask it to you. Maybe we'll wrap up here. When you look at the peace you had as a Christian versus the peace you have now, what's the difference? What's it like?
Oh, it's not even comparable. The peace I have now is a genuine peace. It is a peace within myself. It is a peace with every other human being. It is a peace with not knowing. It is a very, very heartfelt, sincere, personal peace. The peace that I had as a Christian was always contingent on something external, something out of my control, something unanswerable, something out of my grasp. It was always contingent upon some odd variable, which is not a real peace at all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Alan and I talk about, it is very interesting to me that every single person I know, and I know a lot of people who have come out of the cult of Christianity, every one of them is infinitely better off than they were when they were in it.
Yeah.
That says something to me.
I can definitely echo that. I tell people I had more peace in the first day or first week than I did in 40 years as a Christian. And it really is true. And it's just, you realize that you were about to spend your entire life not living a day of your life. And now you
Yep.
have presumably a little time left, hopefully a lot, to live your real life. And that's like winning the lottery. And there's
is.
peace in knowing, like, I don't have the answers now, but at least I know where the answers aren't. And it's like,
Yep.
sort of like, I think often of when I was a Christian, we used to use the phrase, I'm a beggar, but I know where the bread is. You know,
Yep.
I'm not the one with the bread, but I know who is the bread of life. And I have to beg daily for my righteousness and for his power in my life. And so we would pride ourselves in being beggars and slaves who begged for the bread. And when you realize that there is a sort of sustenance, but it's a weird sustenance where the bread is laced with poison, and the bread transforms you a bit into a monster, where you're willing to justify a whole bunch of horrible things like genocide and land theft and slavery and stuff like that. And you're like, you know what? That's not what I thought it was. And it's like I don't have all the answers, and I don't even necessarily know. I'd say I know where the bread is, but I know where it's not.
Yep.
And that's half the battle. To me, that like just knowing that my mind is now free from this, and you use the word Stockholm syndrome, but I know where the answers don't lie. At least that gives you now this beautiful freedom to say I can explore, as opposed to having those incredible blinders. We used to use the phrase all the time, and the hymns would echo it, once I was blind, but now I see. It's like, actually, when I was in Christianity, I was blind then. And the truth did set me free, to quote Jesus, and to quote a lot of other philosophers, the truth did set me free. And the truth is that Christianity is mythology.
Yep.
But it's a beautiful journey. Once you get out, like everything gets so much more beautiful. And I think too, you're just like, I feel like I've spent so much time not really knowing myself that it's almost like you have to give yourself an invitation to say, you know what? You don't know yourself, but also there's a part of you that doesn't like yourself. Like, you've been trained so much to say you're wicked and awful that you almost have to convince yourself, like, look, get to know yourself and at least give yourself a chance. You might be a pretty good person. You might be a pretty cool person.
I was reborn when I left Christianity. Yep. That was when I was reborn.
Born again.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, I know I've asked you some questions here. I feel like we could do some more, but this was a really good overview, a good starting point. Again, when your second book is ready, please let me know, and we'll definitely have you on to sort of put that on blast, and maybe you can even read us some passages from it. But thank you so much. This has been awesome to get to know you, and I definitely want to keep connecting with you and with Alan. But we've been speaking today with Dustin Curlee. Dustin, thanks for your time today. Really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.